Okay. Part two, Life with Jim. Who was your best childhood friend?
That would depend on what part of my childhood. I mean,
Mm,
for the longest time, my brother was probably my best early childhood friend. Absolutely. There
okay.
couldn't there couldn't possibly be any other rival to that. And and then as we grew up and were introduced to the neighborhood, then of course that expands. And so the Devos who lived down the street, Tommy Devo would have been Tom's age.
Okay.
And so he would have been the only one in that family. Tommy Devo's older brother, Denny, would have been older in high school. Diane would have been a little younger than Denny, and then Tommy was our age. So Tommy was would be in that play group. And then, but living right behind my parents' house, there was a family, and they had two boys, but they were older, and so they were not in that Haviland Street play group, but they were very good to us kids who were. And
Mm-hmm.
so they both of those boys played musical instruments in the band at Hamburg High School. And so they would have a, we kids would go over there and they would teach us how to play those instruments. I mean, as I said, they're just very kind kids, and and so we love those boys, and I can't remember their last name. There were two of them. I don't remember their parents at all, but just
Okay.
these two. To us, they would have been big kids because they were in high school,
Right. Right.
and then later on, the people who lived in the house next to my parents on the other side of Hamlet Street, they were the Fallhambers, and and at some point, I'm trying to think of what year it was, and I can't. They moved and they bought a house out on Newton Road on the way to Chestnut Ridge. And that house was bought by the Roses, George and Margaret Rose, and their three kids, Sandy, Wayne, and Bobby. And Bobby was way the youngest. He would have been like Margie's age.
Okay.
So he was just a little too young to be playing with us. But Sandy and Wayne were our age, and so they just became a part of that play group. And then, and again, a little girl, Debbie, who was Margie's age, she lived down on the same side of the street that we lived, but down in the end house. And I can't remember what I said, but she was Margie's friend. And then there was a family that lived next door to them coming back up this way, and they had a little boy who was, I think, a year younger than than Margie and Debbie, and his name was Sammy, and he was always with them. They were all buddies, and Sammy had a brush cut, and those two girls, they would just standing around talking, making plans and all that, and they would just be running their hands through Sammy's brush cut. Very, very distracted.
Did you and Uncle Tom have brush cuts?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
never had a brush cut. It was just not going to do that. Time had a brush cut. Yeah, and I just refused that. That was an indignity that I was not going to tolerate. And then, again, when those two boys who were so kind to us with the musical instruments, they moved out and moved on to somewhere. And the Johnsons moved in. Harold Johnson and his wife and their daughter, and I'm trying to think of her name, and then their little son, Jimmy, who ate worms.
Oh.
No, dude, little kids do eat worms. And when little kids are doing things like eating worms, it tells you one very important thing. They're not getting enough protein in their diet. And Oh, Carol Johnson. That was the girl's name, and she was Roseanne's age. So she and Roseanne. Now we're backing up. These are not in the same time sequence. So Roseanne and Carol they hang around together because they're the same. Later on, Margie and Debbie, but that's years later. It was and that was the gang on, and then there was the Macs, who lived on Lake Street side of the Debos, and Mr. Mac. Mr. Mac was at home. Mrs. Debo. No, Mrs. Mac. Mrs. Mac worked at Beeler's Tea Room on Buffalo Street in Hamburg. And she was a very nice lady. But her husband, apparently one of those guys who really just was not very fond of kids. Of course, you have to remember, if you're a sensitive male human being, the way we were as kids was probably not very nice. I mean, boys do boy things. I mean, they love throwing stones, but not necessarily at things to see how far they can throw them. But we would be picking up the stones in his driveway, and he didn't like it. So he was always yelling at us. And of course we ignored him.
Mm-hmm.
Just, I mean, when you're that young and that age, you can't rationally address somebody like that because, of course, they're being absolutely unreasonable. I mean, you should call a spade a spade.
What do you mean, get out of your yard?
No, we wouldn't be in the or if we rode our bicycle on that grass area between the sidewalk and the street. That would. But I guess when we look at the whole big picture in this whole thing, it really wasn't all that bad. There were no shots fired. No. And then, however, and then history comes to. We have the Debos, the Macs, and then the next house, the middle house of the three houses that were built after the war. We now have the Leafs. Mr. and Mrs. Leaf, who turns out were Nazi spies during the war.
No way.
And they were Nazis. They were card-carrying Nazis. And what they did was they would have Nazi documents, propaganda and all this kind of stuff printed in the United States because it was legal to print that stuff here. Possessing it in Germany meant prison. And then they would smuggle it into Germany to keep the Nazi party alive in Germany.
Wow.
Yeah. And these were the folks who lived in the street.
Wow. How long did they live there?
For years.
Okay.
And then finally I presume they just like, moved away, got a better job, or we have no idea, or they were just arrested.
Mm-hmm.
By the FBI, the CIA, the BLT, I don't know.